August 7, 1943, 3:45 in the afternoon. Japanese Army nurse Kimiko Sato peers through the wire fence of the women's prisoner of war camp near Hopi Mesa, Arizona, observing with tactical fascination what appears to be sophisticated American military preparation involving Native American personnel whose elaborate face painting and systematic body decoration suggest advanced camouflage techniques designed to enhance battlefield effectiveness through visual concealment that could provide tactical advantages during reconnaissance. Operations requiring enemy personnel to remain undetected while gathering intelligence about strategic positions and enemy movements in desert terrain. Sato watches Hopi spiritual leader Joseph Sekakwaptewa apply intricate patterns of red, yellow, and black pigments to his face and arms using traditional designs that appear consistent with military camouflage designed to break up human silhouette while providing environmental concealment that could enhance tactical effectiveness during patrol operations requiring systematic observation of enemy positions without detection by hostile forces whose awareness could compromise operational security and strategic objectives. The systematic nature of Hopi painting activities suggests carefully planned military preparation, where participants demonstrate advanced understanding of visual concealment through traditional methods that appear designed to enhance battlefield effectiveness, while utilizing cultural knowledge about environmental conditions and terrain characteristics that could provide tactical advantages during combat operations, requiring systematic infiltration and reconnaissance activities against enemy positions. The precision that Hopi men demonstrate in paint application appears consistent with military protocol designed to create standardized camouflage patterns while maintaining unit identification through systematic use of traditional designs that serve tactical objectives by providing environmental concealment without compromising operational coordination between personnel whose individual concealment must balance personal protection with collective effectiveness during coordinated military operations. In military minds, paint means camouflage. Military personnel trained in tactical operations naturally interpret visual modification through framework of strategic concealment that seeks to identify battlefield advantages, reconnaissance techniques, and operational methods that might provide intelligence about enemy capabilities, while revealing cultural practices that could serve military objectives through systematic integration of traditional knowledge with contemporary warfare requirements. But sometimes, witnessing sacred ceremonies reveals the spiritual battles that transcend all physical warfare. Sometimes, traditional practices that appear tactical actually represent fundamental spiritual values about protection, blessing, and connection to divine forces that exists independently of military objectives while demonstrating cultural sophistication that prioritizes spiritual welfare over strategic preparation for violence against enemy populations whose cultural traditions emphasize different approaches to protection and spiritual strength. The women's prisoner of war camp near Hopi Mesa had been established within traditional Hopi territory where indigenous spiritual practices emphasized ceremonial protection and sacred observance that maintained cultural identity while serving community purposes rather than military objectives through systematic adherence to traditional practices that provided spiritual rather than tactical benefits for participants seeking divine protection rather than battlefield advantages. Sato's background included traditional Japanese military nursing education that emphasized tactical assessment and strategic observation through systematic evaluation of enemy activities that might reveal combat techniques or operational methods while interpreting all group activities as potential military procedures designed to enhance battlefield effectiveness through cultural practices that served strategic rather than spiritual objectives. Her capture 14 months earlier during Pacific operations had resulted from overwhelming American air superiority, that demonstrated technological advancement while revealing American capacity for systematic warfare that challenged Japanese assumptions about democratic restraint and strategic limitations that supposedly prevented total commitment to military objectives requiring sustained violence against enemy civilian populations and infrastructure. The cultural framework that prevented Sato from understanding Hopi spiritual practices included Japanese military emphasis on tactical efficiency and strategic assessment, where all organized activities served military objectives through established methods rather than spiritual development that existed independently of warfare, while maintaining traditional practices that emphasized community welfare rather than battlefield preparation. Hopi spiritual traditions reflected cultural values about ceremonial protection, sacred observance, and divine connection that demonstrated indigenous wisdom about spiritual warfare, while providing cultural framework for understanding individual responsibility within collective harmony that served spiritual protection rather than military objectives through systematic adherence to traditional practices that maintained sacred rather than tactical heritage. The Hopi spiritual leaders who participated in traditional ceremonies included community members whose cultural background combined ancestral sacred knowledge with contemporary civilian life, creating spiritual identity that maintained indigenous values while serving community purposes through systematic integration of traditional practices with spiritual observance that demonstrated protection without requiring military service or tactical preparation. The systematic analysis that Sato conducted of Hopi painting activities included detailed observation of design patterns, application techniques, and strategic positioning that appeared consistent with military camouflage designed to provide battlefield concealment while maintaining unit identification through traditional methods that served tactical objectives requiring environmental adaptation for combat effectiveness during reconnaissance operations. The design patterns that Hopi participants utilized suggested sophisticated understanding of visual concealment through systematic use of traditional pigments that appeared designed to maximize camouflage effectiveness, while maintaining cultural identification through ancestral designs that served tactical objectives by providing environmental concealment without compromising operational coordination between personnel requiring individual protection. The application techniques that spiritual participants demonstrated included precise methodology and systematic coverage that appeared consistent with military protocol designed to create effective camouflage, while utilizing traditional cultural knowledge that served tactical objectives through systematic integration of indigenous practices with contemporary warfare requirements for enhanced battlefield effectiveness. The spiritual significance that Hopi ceremonies actually represented included sacred protection, divine blessing, and ceremonial purification that served community spiritual welfare rather than military preparation, while demonstrating indigenous wisdom about spiritual warfare that transcended tactical objectives to emphasize divine protection and sacred connection between individual participants and ancestral spiritual forces. The gradual explanation that Joseph Sekakwaptewa attempted to provide about ceremonial rather than military purposes created cognitive dissonance for Japanese prisoners, whose cultural background emphasized utilitarian activities where all organized practices served strategic objectives rather than spiritual development or sacred observance that existed independently of military applications while maintaining traditional practices. The disbelief that Japanese prisoners demonstrated when learning about spiritual rather than tactical purposes reflected cultural barriers that prevented understanding of activities serving divine protection rather than battlefield concealment, indicating systematic worldview where all organized practices contributed to military objectives rather than spiritual development that enhanced community welfare through sacred rather than strategic practices. The introduction to concepts of sacred ceremonies and spiritual battles challenged Japanese military understanding of organized activities by emphasizing divine protection rather than tactical concealment, demonstrating Hopi values that prioritized spiritual welfare over military preparation while maintaining traditional practices that served sacred rather than strategic objectives through systematic adherence to ceremonial rather than tactical requirements. The recognition that protection could transcend physical camouflage represented fundamental spiritual learning that challenged Japanese military assumptions about organized activities while demonstrating Hopi values that celebrated divine protection without requiring systematic preparation for warfare or territorial conquest through military aggression that eliminated civilian populations and destroyed cultural institutions serving spiritual rather than tactical purposes. The invitation that Sato eventually received to observe ceremony preparation reflected gradual understanding that painting activities served spiritual protection rather than tactical purposes, while providing sacred education that contributed to spiritual enlightenment rather than strategic intelligence gathering for military operations, requiring systematic preparation for violence against enemy populations whose cultural traditions emphasized different approaches to protection. The discovery of spiritual traditions that protected rather than attacked enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about organized activities while demonstrating Hopi wisdom about divine protection that served community spiritual welfare rather than military preparation through systematic practices that enhanced spiritual welfare without requiring adherence to tactical objectives or strategic preparation for warfare against enemy forces. The cultural exchange that occurred through ceremonial observation included mutual recognition of spiritual wisdom that existed independently of military objectives while demonstrating common human values about divine protection and sacred connection that transcended national boundaries and temporary political hostilities between populations whose essential spirituality remained constant despite systematic warfare and religious differences. The appreciation that Japanese prisoners developed for Hopi spiritual warrior traditions included understanding that ceremonial activities served divine protection rather than tactical purposes, while demonstrating cultural sophistication that prioritized spiritual welfare over military preparation through systematic practices that enhanced community welfare without requiring strategic preparation for violence against enemy populations whose traditions emphasized different approaches. The development of respect for nonviolent forms of spiritual strength included recognition of divine power that challenged tactical assumptions while demonstrating that spiritual achievement could transcend military effectiveness when cultural values emphasized sacred protection over battlefield preparation through systematic adherence to traditional practices that served spiritual rather than strategic objectives, requiring ceremonial rather than tactical development. The integration of spiritual understanding into prisoner worldview included recognition that Hopi traditions offered alternatives to military solutions while demonstrating cultural sophistication that prioritized divine protection and sacred observance over systematic preparation for violence through organized activities that served spiritual development rather than tactical objectives requiring strategic training for warfare against enemy populations. The transformation that occurred from tactical to spiritual interpretation included fundamental re-evaluation of assumptions about organized activities while acknowledging that spiritual development could transcend military preparation when cultural values emphasized divine protection over tactical effectiveness through systematic practices that enhanced spiritual welfare without requiring temporal preparation for warfare against enemy populations whose traditions emphasized different approaches. The broader implications of understanding indigenous spiritual practices included recognition that Hopi culture offered alternatives to systematic militarism while demonstrating spiritual sophistication that served divine protection and sacred observance through traditional practices that prioritized ceremonial protection over tactical preparation and strategic development for warfare, requiring systematic violence against civilian populations whose traditions emphasized different spiritual approaches. Sato's post-war testimony about Hopi spiritual traditions included appreciation for ceremonial activities that demonstrated alternative approaches to protection, while providing spiritual education that challenged military assumptions about organized activities serving tactical rather than sacred objectives through systematic practices that enhanced community welfare without requiring military preparation for violence against enemy populations. The ongoing relationships that developed between former enemies through shared spiritual understanding included mutual recognition of divine wisdom that transcended military classifications, while demonstrating that authentic human connections could overcome systematic hostility when circumstances provided opportunity for cross-cultural interaction through activities that celebrated spiritual protection rather than tactical preparation. The education that occurred through ceremonial participation included understanding of Hopi values that emphasized divine protection within spiritual frameworks, while demonstrating cultural organization that prioritized sacred observance over systematic military preparation for warfare against enemy populations, whose essential spirituality remained constant despite temporary political hostilities and systematic indoctrination designed to eliminate recognition of shared spiritual potential. The broader social implications of spiritual recognition included contributions to post-war cultural exchange that emphasized shared human values about divine protection and sacred observance, while demonstrating that spiritual understanding could overcome systematic militarism when individual choice prioritized authentic spiritual development over collective adherence to tactical objectives requiring systematic preparation for violence against populations. The documentation that emerged from prisoner ceremonial observation included testimony about Hopi cultural values that emphasized spiritual protection and divine blessing, while demonstrating indigenous wisdom about sacred warfare that challenged systematic militarism designed to justify violence against populations whose traditions prioritized spiritual development over tactical preparation for physical warfare against enemy forces whose essential spirituality transcended temporal conflicts. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners of discovering spiritual rather than military purpose in Hopi painting included fundamental reevaluation of cultural assumptions about organized activities, while recognizing that divine protection could transcend tactical preparation when cultural values emphasized spiritual welfare over systematic strategic development that served sacred rather than military objectives, requiring ceremonial rather than battlefield preparation. In the end, the war paint that Japanese prisoners had interpreted as military camouflage became evidence that Hopi culture preserved spiritual traditions without requiring systematic tactical preparation, demonstrating indigenous values that prioritized divine protection and sacred observance over military development and strategic preparation for warfare against enemy populations whose traditions emphasized different approaches to spiritual protection and ceremonial welfare. The transformation from tactical suspicion to spiritual appreciation illustrated that witnessing sacred traditions could reveal divine wisdom more effectively than military analysis, proving that authentic cultural exchange through observed spiritual practices could challenge systematic militarism while demonstrating fundamental possibilities for spiritual development that transcended conventional expectations about organized activities serving tactical rather than sacred purposes. The ceremony that initially appeared military actually represented ancient expression of human spirituality that protected souls without requiring violence, demonstrating that indigenous values could expand rather than restrict spiritual potential when cultural organization prioritized divine protection over systematic military preparation, that served tactical objectives through organized activities requiring strategic training for warfare against enemy populations. The ceremonies that defended souls more effectively than weapons revealed that spiritual understanding could overcome systematic militarism through observed sacred practices that demonstrated fundamental truths about divine protection, transcending tactical objectives, while creating foundation for recognition that spiritual welfare could serve community protection regardless of military classifications or strategic preparations. The paint that blessed, rather than concealed humanity, demonstrated that spiritual wisdom could exceed military doctrine when traditional practices provided alternatives to systematic violence, proving that authentic recognition of indigenous spirituality could transform understanding of protection while creating possibilities for cultural exchange that honored spiritual development over tactical preparation, requiring systematic adherence to military objectives designed for warfare against populations whose essential spirituality transcended all earthly conflicts.